Hello, students. This is Chapter 31.3, A Global Conflict, Video Vocab Notes. At this point, the war is well established in Europe, and Adolf Hitler does something sort of unexpected. He invades the Soviet Union. This is a lesson he might have learned from Napoleon, or even from the German experience in World War I, fighting a war on two fronts. But he makes the decision anyway. He had not defeated Britain, either in the Battle of Britain with the RAF or in the bombing of London. He was unable to demoralize the British into surrender. So instead, he turns his attention to the East. His main goal here is to defeat the Soviet Union and claim both the oil and the agricultural resources of Eastern Europe. Places like Hungary, very good for growing wheat. The oil fields of the Caucasus Mountains and the Baku region of the Caspian Sea, all very necessary for Hitler's war machine. So in 1941, he launches Operation Barbarossa. It's very effective initially. He makes it all the way to Moscow, which you know is very far inside the Soviet Union. However, the attack stalls before he can fully capture Moscow, and the Soviet army, despite losing lots of territory, manages to turn back the Nazi army. Part of what they do to make this happen is Stalin implements the same scorched earth policy that they had used against Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. As the Soviet military withdraws, they leave nothing behind that the Germans can use. They burn the towns, they kill the livestock, they poison the fields, poison the wells. There's nothing left in their retreat for the German army to use. As this invasion of the Soviet Union takes place, Hitler is developing and expanding his vision for Europe. His intention is to claim all of Europe's material resources for Germany, and at the same time eliminating from the places he conquers not just the Jewish people, but Slavs, Romani, communists, any political opposition to fascism, homosexuals, people with disabilities, basically anyone who doesn't fit into his sort of idealized vision for the German people as a superior ethnic group. That brings us to the Holocaust, and I know you've all studied the Holocaust extensively in your time in school, but I want to help unpack additional details as I'm able. The process that Hitler undertook to eliminate what he saw as the inferior people of Europe began in earnest in 1941. His initial move was in the places where he had conquered, in Poland, in Austria, in parts of Eastern Europe, where there was a strong Jewish population. He initially isolated them, forcing them to live in segregated parts of town known as ghettos. By the summer of that year, even though the ghettos were miserable and isolated, living conditions were cramped and crowded and unsanitary, disease was rampant, and people were starving and dying in great numbers. By summer of 1941, it wasn't happening quickly enough for the Nazi government. And so that's when we begin to see the forced relocation of Jewish people and the others that I mentioned, communists and Romani and so forth. Relocation to concentration camps, imprisonment, hard labor in producing materials for the German war machine, and ultimately mass executions, mass murder, genocide in these concentration camps. What Hitler called the final solution ultimately was going to be the complete extermination of the Jewish people of Europe, making room for his idealized Aryan master race. Initially, he would have been content with enslaving them and making them work for the Germans, but ultimately extermination became the goal. There was a lot of resistance to this all over Europe. Many Jews managed to escape and either go into hiding or go on the run. There were effective resistance movements everywhere the German army went. Everywhere the Nazi government was able to extend its reach, there was resistance. There was resistance in Poland and in Czechoslovakia and everywhere else. But ultimately, there's a long tradition of anti-Semitism in Europe. People were not willing necessarily to reach out to the Jewish people, to open their homes, to help them hide. Many Europeans just sort of let this go on for various reasons. There wasn't a lot of information coming out of Europe about the Holocaust. We didn't know initially how stark things were. Now, we had an idea. There was enough news coming out of Europe that we knew some pretty tremendous things were happening. But the Allied governments did not react, and the full horror, the shocking scale and brutality of the Holocaust was only fully realized after the Allied victory in Europe, when we began opening the concentration camps and finding out exactly what had happened there. This section's called a global conflict, so we need to deal with the Pacific as well and talk a little bit about Japanese expansion and Pearl Harbor. We know that Japan had pretty well secured control in China in the 1930s. There were still British and French and Dutch colonies in parts of China and Southeast Asia that were effectively undefended at this point, and in the path of Japanese expansion. Those countries, those colonists, were very worried about the heavily militarized, extremely modern, extremely efficient Japanese army bearing down on them. To add to these fears, Japan announced what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This is basically not Japanese nationalism, but a form of Asian nationalism. This idea that under Japanese leadership, Asia would be united under Asian rule, not European. That they would drive the Europeans out, that they would reclaim the European colonies, and that Asia would be governed as this sort of Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, prosperous and unified under Asian rule. One of the major obstacles to Japanese expansion was that the United States had the ability to place embargoes on oil and iron, two things that the Japanese needed to continue to fuel their militaristic expansion. They needed to build warships. They needed to fuel ships and aircraft. And so the United States' ability to restrict their access to oil and iron was an obstacle. On a date that you should know, one of the handful of dates in history that you should always know, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Navy and Air Forces attacked Pearl Harbor. There were thousands of people killed, dozens and dozens of aircraft destroyed on the ground, multiple warships sunk in the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. However, the American carrier fleet was at sea, and the ship repair facilities at Pearl Harbor were not damaged. So the attack was not as crippling as Japan had hoped. What it did do was ensure America's entry into the war. The Americans had thought that the attack would come, but they did not expect an attack on Pearl Harbor. They had thought that the attack would be elsewhere in Southeast Asia, perhaps the Philippines or someplace else. At this point, the United States is fully into the war. Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, declaring their sort of unification in the Axis powers. And so Great Britain and the United States accordingly declare war on those three powers. At this point, it truly is a global conflict. And from this point on, we have to look at both the war in Europe and in North Africa and also in the Pacific.